The beautiful things in life are often born out of great bitterness. The morning sun glinted on the smooth surface of West Grand Lake, and the cold morning air hung still. It was the dead calm of an early October morning, when most of the seasonal tourists and cottage dwellers had long since returned to their remote homes and towns. The only souls within a radius of many miles, in this exposed expanse of Maine woods and waters, were the hardy year-round inhabitants and a few travelers from the Indian reservation to the east. The oar cut the water almost silently, propelling my canoe to the shore of the lake, where comfort and warmth awaited me in the cottage that I now called home. The three-room house, with an attic for sleeping, was warmed by an old Dover wood-burning stove, on which stood a copper kettle with hot water for making tea. It was a simple life, very far from the complexities of my previous existence. My grandfather built this house long before I was born, and when he passed away several years ago, he left it to me in his will. When I was a boy, I spent my summer holidays here, exploring every corner of the West Grand and its tributaries, including the stretches of river down to Big Lake. It was a place for serious fishing and hunting, rugged and remote, but accessible to those who longed to experience the Far East. As I got closer to the shore, I noticed her figure wrapped in warm clothing, which was clearly not enough for the cold weather compared to her warm southern climate in South Carolina. The temperature here was 40 degrees cooler than her usual 18 degrees, and I knew that under layers of inadequate clothing, she stood shivering, trying to keep warm. She never understood my love for flannel. When the aluminum bottom of the canoe touched the gravel and I stepped onto the hard shore, I looked at her with as much coldness as my tortured, emotionally drained mind could muster. She looked good, but I looked different. "Daryl, we need to talk," she said. I didn't talk to her for almost a year, and the truth was that I wasn't ready to talk to her. Moreover, I was not sure that I would ever want to talk to her again, in this life or the next. I had my own life, and I lived the way I wanted, and everything was fine with me. I nodded towards the cottage. The smell of baked beans and coffee was in the air when we walked in, and after I added more wood to the stove, 2 mugs of coffee sat on my kitchen table. "Are you hungry?" I asked. "No, thank you. I had something to eat at the store on the highway before I arrived," she replied. "This is good." Surprised it was open so early. Early's store opened at 4:30 am during the season, but after the children returned to school and the cottages began to empty, it usually didn't open until 6 am, except for deer hunting season in November. I looked over at my ex-wife sitting at the table and wondered what the hell she might want to discuss after everything we'd been through. "Teresa, why are you here?" She twirled the spoon, adding a little sugar to her black coffee, and looked into my eyes. Once upon a time, we could read each other's thoughts with just a glance. Now it was a different time, a different era. "The divorce, I didn't get it," she whispered barely audibly. I looked at her carefully and went to the stove to heat up a plate of beans and ham. "What do you mean?" "Everything is already finished. We both signed the papers almost a year ago. Everything was decided in May." "No, Daryl, I didn't submit the documents. My lawyer gave me 3 sets, and I still keep them," she replied, looking out the window and turning her gaze back to me. I couldn't do it. The beans in my mouth felt like an empty toy as I thought about her words. I swallowed hard. "A year ago, we burned bridges, destroyed foundations, and scorched the earth with furious torches. I left with 1 backpack and a few things, quitting my job as a communications director for a company in Charleston, South Carolina, and going freelance." I looked at her with disbelief and humility. "I couldn't do it," she said. "How the hell can someone not do what has already been done, destroying 2 marriages and alienating her daughter's feelings for her father?" For the first time in years, I was speechless. I dumped the contents of my plate into the trash and rinsed it in the sink. I still had not responded to her revelation and did not know what to say, even if I wanted to. I put on my jacket, left the cottage, and got into my Dodge pickup. She didn't budge even when I started the engine. Sitting there with the engine running, I tried to remember the events that had brought us here, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. I met Teresa almost 20 years ago when we were both 20-somethings trying to build careers in Atlanta. I had just started a job in HR at GPI downtown, and Teresa was working at a PR agency right across the street. We literally ran into each other during lunch break, and after mutual apologies, we went to lunch together. From that moment, we started dating, and a year later, we got married. We were ordinary people living relatively ordinary lives. A couple of years later, she became pregnant, despite all the precautions, and we had a little girl named Kelsey. Before Kelsey started school, we moved to Teresa's hometown of Charleston, South Carolina, where we both got good jobs and continued to live the so-called American dream. Of course, we had conflicts and disagreements. She was a Southern girl, and I knew it when I married her, although I always had a hidden dream of one day returning to Maine and living the life my grandfather said should be lived. This never happened, and I never blamed her for it. We both loved living in Charleston and lived life generously. When Kelsey entered high school, things began to change. Now I can say this, looking back, but then everything was still within the bounds of normality. We both changed jobs. I stayed at my company, but moved to the communications department. Teresa got a job at a startup marketing company and soon began traveling more. After a while, she was promoted to Deputy Director of Business Development and was now on the road every other week, which was a clear change. She began dressing up more often, with more cleavage and more revealing clothing, and began wearing perfume more often. Meetings with clients and dinners became more frequent, and late nights became a habit. I had no idea what was going on when she was on business trips. At the same time, I myself was faced with a lot of work tasks and pressure from a company that was going through reorganization and difficult times. I just didn't pay attention to what was happening around me. We still had moments of privacy. We still had great sex when she was home. The problem was that it wasn't there often, and I was so immersed in my work world that I didn't notice it until it was too late. It was too late that night when I came home to find her sitting at the kitchen table with a black eye and a split lip. Before I could reach her, she raised her hand. "It's not what you think, or maybe it's what you think, but sit down, Daryl," she said. I looked at her and sat down. She looked haggard, drunk, and bleary-eyed. Without taking her eyes off me, she handed me the envelope. "I am filing for divorce." There were no discussions or arguments. It was a simple statement. The envelope contained 4 copies of divorce documents with its terms. Let me be honest, I was stunned. She got up from the table, took her purse, and walked out the door. Before I could react or stop her, she was already in a car I had never seen before, driven by a man I had already seen. She left with James Riley, her boss. All this happened in a matter of minutes. I walked in, saw her, sat down. She told me about the divorce and left with another man. Not even 3 minutes had passed. The car must have pulled up right behind me. I sat on the couch, trying to process what had just happened. It's a feeling that's hard to explain, somewhere between losing a loved one and being robbed. It took me a long time to realize what had happened, and perhaps the worst thing was that it seemed like there was nothing I could do about it. I wandered around the house, trying to assess the emotional devastation, and began to notice things. Some of her clothes were missing, as well as many of her personal belongings. Several of my daughter's things were also missing. Kelsey left too. I immediately called Kelsey's cell phone, but her phone was disconnected. After leaving her a message asking her to call me back and trying to get through again, I returned to the kitchen and picked up the papers to read them. She intended to take everything from me, or at least she intended to do so. She wanted 70% equity in the house, 2/3 of our savings for herself and Kelsey, half of my retirement account, and $1,500 a week in child support. I threw the papers back on the table and poured myself a glass of rum, no cola. I repeated this several times, and the next thing I remembered was the sun shining brightly. I lay on the grass in my backyard, staring into the morning sun, still covered in dew. Gathering my strength, I went into the house and got into the shower, just stood there while the water flowed over me. I remembered the previous night well enough to realize that my wife had left me, taking my daughter with her. I called work as soon as I found a phone number and took the day off, explaining the situation to my boss. She understood the situation since she herself divorced her cheating husband a couple of years ago. Sitting at the table, I looked through the papers again and soon smashed my fist on the doorframe until it bled. I think it was at that moment that I decided not to give up. I was going to fight. I decided to fight, and the first thing I did was call my lawyer, only to find out that Teresa had already consulted with him, and he could not take my case. However, he referred me to another lawyer, whom I met with later that day. He explained everything to me in simple words. You will receive a fair distribution. She earns more than you, so there will be no alimony. She will receive half the savings and 50% of the equity in the house. Since she has her own retirement account, she won't get a share of yours. However, if your daughter decides to live with her mother, there is nothing you can do about it. Moreover, by the time this is all over, she will already be 18. This was my option, and the lawyers sent a counteroffer to Teresa and arranged a conference for all parties. Unfortunately, Teresa, through her lawyer, refused to meet with me, and shortly thereafter, I received a restraining order against her and Kelsey, preventing me from contacting them in any way. A couple of weeks later, Teresa's lawyer submitted an amended claim agreeing to the terms we proposed, and on the advice of my lawyer, I signed all 4 copies. I agreed for Teresa to come to the house in the presence of my lawyer to pick up her things. I chose not to be home at this moment, especially given the restraining order. 6 months later, I had to get a divorce without knowing why, other than my suspicions that she had cheated on me. These suspicions were confirmed a couple of months after I signed the papers as I prepared to show the house to a potential buyer. I opened the door to a knock and saw an attractive woman in front of me with a package in her hands. I greeted her and asked who she was. "Excuse me, Mr. Carson. My name is Melissa Riley, and I would like to talk to you a little about your wife and my husband, James Riley," she said. I looked at her carefully before inviting her inside. I offered her coffee, and she kindly accepted. After we sat down, I started talking. "Mrs. Riley, before you start, I need to tell you that my wife and I are getting a divorce, and we haven't spoken since she told me she was filing for divorce. I also haven't seen or heard from my daughter since then, and frankly, I have absolutely no idea why. So if you can shed any light on this, I'm all ears," I said, looking at her without any expectations. "Mr. Carson, I am also divorcing my husband because of his infidelity with your wife, Teresa Carson. I returned home unexpectedly the same day your wife told you about the divorce. I caught my husband having sex with your wife in his bed. Sorry, but I must admit that in my anger I hit her several times before he could stop me," she added with a small grin, apparently remembering this moment. I remembered the black eye and the split lip. "Well, I turned to my husband and told him not to be in the house when I got back. And she went to stay with her sister in Somerville for a few days. When I returned the following week, he had collected his personal belongings and left a forwarding address. The next day I filed for divorce, although he had not yet agreed to the terms. He tries to fight, but he has no chance of success. Our children are already adults, and frankly, this is not the first time he has cheated, and I am sure it will not be the last." She handed me the package and told me that it contained surveillance footage of James and Teresa's several visits to her home, as far as the system's memory allowed. The husband admitted to her that their affair lasted about a year and Teresa worked for him. "Does he know that you have these notes?" I asked. "Oh no, and your wife doesn't know either. I filed for divorce due to irreconcilable differences. I see no point in mentioning treason in court. The house belonged to my parents, and he has no rights to it. I lived on Sullivan's Island all my life and inherited it from them. He walks away with what is his and will pay child support. I don't need money. No, I just want this to end. But I also want you to have this evidence. He said that you and your wife are getting a divorce, but they are not living together. He broke things off with her, hoping that I would stay with him. It's unlikely that this will happen, believe me." I thanked her for the package, and we continued our conversation. When Melissa Riley left, I stood and thought about how stupid unfaithful lovers can be. Did my wife think that some kind of happy life awaited her with a man who cheated on his own wife? Apparently she thought so, and now the domino effect has begun to unfold. I felt some twisted joy at her misadventures, but it didn't answer the questions I still had about why and how my daughter took such a side in this battle. The following week after Melissa Riley's visit, I received an offer on the house that arranged for the solicitors to distribute the assets, and we completed the deal the following month. Since the house was paid off in full, it provided a nice payout for both Teresa and me. Teresa's share went into an escrow account along with other finances, and I returned to my job and what was left of my regular life. One of my longtime hobbies has been writing freelance articles for several obscure publications, mostly about the outdoors and outdoors. I also edited a few jobs on the side, although none of these activities brought in a consistent or significant income. But everything changed in March of the following year. Mother Nature magazine published an article online that I had written a few months earlier and contacted me with an offer to write a regular column for their monthly issue. It wasn't a lot of money, but for $500 a month for the next year, I was willing to accept it. The first column was supposed to appear in the April issue if I could turn it in within 2 weeks. I did this, and 2 weeks after publication, I received 3 more offers, one for monthly publication and 2 for quarterly publication. So my monthly freelancing income was $850 per month plus $1,000 quarterly. It was then that I made what many might say was a stupid decision. I put my share of the sale of the house into a special account and left it alone. There were about $250,000 there. In the 20 years of savings that remained after Teresa took her share, I had accumulated about the same amount. My retirement plan and 401k account remained untouched until I could start withdrawing them. If I didn't invest the money in real estate, I would have to pay capital gains taxes, so I decided to use it to buy land adjacent to the cottage I inherited on West Grand Lake. I was able to purchase land with shoreline on both sides of my cabin for $200,000 and planned to use the remaining $50,000 to improve the old cabin. To say it was difficult to resign from my job would be an understatement. I have made many good friends over the years, and some of them have supported me through difficult times, especially in recent months. A small number of people knew about my circumstances, and one of my colleagues was interested in renting the small apartment I had rented after selling my house. I gave her most of the furniture I left behind after the divorce, as well as a bunch of little things Teresa left behind. In return, she gave me the best sex I had experienced in a long time. This was not planned, of course. We opened a bottle of Pinot Grigio to celebrate her move, and after we were halfway through the second bottle, she pulled down her pants and took off her blouse. My shorts were on the floor in no time, and she began with some fantastic pleasure. At 44, I felt like I was 25 and like the whole world was at my feet. She did more for my self-esteem than any therapist could. The next day, I left for the north, stopping at her place to say goodbye for the second round. I didn't say no, but I didn't know when I'd be back. I left her the key to my storage room and told her if she needed anything to use it. The warehouse was paid for 2 years in advance. My grandfather's cottage was looked after by his cousin who lived nearby. Teresa and I had come here every year for a week since our wedding, so I knew the house was in order. However, it was nice to know that his family was watching over him. It took me 3 days to get there, moving at a tourist pace. I stopped at a few interesting spots along the way, and by the time I arrived, my pickup truck and trailer were packed to the brim. The cottage was in excellent condition. The propane tanks had recently been refilled after the snow melted. Someone stacked a couple of cubic meters of unsplit firewood behind the house, and my father brought several loads of gravel for the road. Overall, the place was ready for me to move in. The lake was 5 miles from the highway, mostly on a gravel road, and the cottage itself had a diesel generator for electricity, firewood for heating and hot water, and the toilet was outside a couple of steps from the house. The house had a gas stove and a refrigerator, as well as gas lamps, which worked no worse than electric lamps. A couple of years ago, I installed satellite internet, although the connection was not the fastest. One of the improvements I was planning was to connect solar panels so that I wouldn't have to run a generator to communicate with the outside world. By June, I was fully settled and even took on a few additional publishing orders. This gave me about $1,500 a month in income, more than enough to meet my needs since I had no mortgage or utility payments except for propane refills twice a year and an internet fee of $1.50 a month. It was much better than the old telephone modem. The only thing missing was female affection. Over 20 years of marriage, I had become accustomed to certain carnal pleasures, and self-pleasure was a poor substitute for real sex. The problem was that I lived in the middle of nowhere, and even when I got to the highway, I was still in the middle of nowhere. However, even here people continue to live. In the July issue of Alternative Ground, I talked about my transition from a corporate office in Charleston to the wilderness on the shores of West Grand Lake. She knocked on my door on the 4th of July. At first, I didn't know what to think. She stood there in chest-high wading boots, with long golden hair braided in a braid that went down to the small of her back. I saw her from afar as she crossed the lake. There are many fishing boats on the lake in the summer, but most launch from one of the few public docks, as there are very few cottages on the lake. My grandfather's cottage and several other cabins were built in the 1920s before the paper companies bought up most of the land. This young woman was crossing the lake from above me, which meant she must have come from one of the remaining houses. She smiled broadly at me. "Are you the guy who writes here, coming from the south?" she asked in perfect Manx dialect. "Yes, madam, it's me," I answered. There is an art to carrying on a conversation with a Maine resident. There is a certain technique when communicating with a Maine resident, an accent and a way of speaking that comes naturally to those who grew up here. If you're not local, trying to copy this talk seems fake. People from down east don't even think they have an accent. It's other people from afar who say so. "Okay, so I didn't waste my gas," she replied. I invited her to come in for coffee, and since it was almost dinner time, I offered her some beans and ham and a piece of black bread. She readily agreed. The brown boots slid off her body, and a slender woman of about 35, dressed in jeans and a t-shirt, stepped out. She put on the sandals she was carrying in her bag, and I showed her where to wash up. Her name was Sally Clussy, with a long U like in key. She was indeed 35 years old, and she lived in one of the houses on the other side of the lake upstream from me, at least in the summer. During the school year, she was a teacher at a school on an Indian reservation funded by the federal government. Like me, she inherited her little house, but lived much more remotely than I did. I could get to the lake on the logging company's gravel road, but she had to bring everything she needed by boat from the public dock. She and I immediately liked each other, and I began helping her deliver supplies and materials on a weekly basis. It was easier to store some things with me and transport them by boat to her house than to lug everything from the dock at once for several trips. She had everything arranged in much the same way as mine: gas, generator, satellite, internet. One day she brought a radio station with her and installed it for me. Now we can talk to each other whenever we want. It will run from your solar panel during the day and from your battery at night. It almost doesn't need to be charged, she said with a smile, as if she had just solved a difficult astrophysics problem. In the evenings, we usually left the radios on and chatted if there was nothing else to do. I tried to write my articles in the early morning and evening, and around 9 o'clock, I turned on the walkie-talkie to see if she was in touch. Sally actively used the radio station. She had many acquaintances scattered around the area. I remember it was around 10 p.m. when I heard a double click on the radio, our designated signal. She went live. "Hello, Smoochie, I'm bored. I'm heading to you if you don't want to come to me," she said. I was pretty sure she had been drinking because she had never called me Smoochie before. "I think it's best for you to stay put." "Looks like you had a little too much today, Sally Smoochie," I replied, smiling to myself. She was flirting, and I liked it. "No, I'll be with you in 30 minutes, and then I'll get drunk," she said. Sally kept her word. Half an hour later, her boat arrived at my pier, and she came out with a backpack and a bottle of rum. I was still lighting the fire on the beach, and we sat on the sun loungers, sipping spiced rum by the brightly burning fire. Neither of us had any sense of proportion anymore when she stood up and took off her t-shirt, revealing perfect apple-sized breasts. She smiled at me, touched her breasts, and pulled down her shorts, standing completely naked on the shore in front of the flames of the fire. She was incredibly beautiful, and even if she wasn't, my testosterone would have left me no other choice. We ended up in bed. I don't know what time we fell asleep, but the next morning, when we woke up, we did it again. And then, when we dived naked into the cold water at the pier, the remnants of passion were completely washed away. From that moment on, we became casual lovers. This happened infrequently, once a week or every two. None of us were looking for replacement spouses. Sally was dumped by some dumbass from Massachusetts who couldn't even wipe his ass in the woods without instructions, and she understood what I went through with Teresa, or more precisely, with what I experienced. At this point, I didn't care what happened to my ex-wife. Although Teresa was now just a painful memory, I was still troubled by the estrangement of my daughter Kelsey. As far as I knew, I still had a restraining order against me, prohibiting me from contacting her, and I had no desire to explain myself to the court again. I decided that if Kelsey ever wanted to explain why I had become the family outcast, she would find a way to get to me. I hated to think that way, but I had no other options. Living in the wilderness is a challenge for many. Loneliness and isolation force us to find entertainment on our own. When I was younger, I was never into fly fishing. Living here full-time, I decided to master the art, especially with one of the best populations of lake salmon right next door and the Grand Lake stream at the lake's outlet. There was simply no better place to explore. Between this and the growing number of freelance assignments, I was enjoying my new renaissance. By the fall, I was able to increase my income to $30,000 a year. A couple of newspapers in Bangor and Portland hired me, so I definitely wouldn't starve or freeze. My first vegetable garden was quite successful thanks to Sally, who seemed to have green fingers. After a trip to Calais, where we bought a truckload of canning supplies, we were able to stockpile a large amount of supplies for the winter. When the school year began in early September, Sally returned to the reservation, but spent all weekends at the lake. Her house was winter hardy, but not prepared for year-round living, and when the lake began to freeze, she would not be able to get to it. So September was for her a time of preparation for closing the house, and for me a time of preparation for a harsh winter. By the time November arrived, we had already completed all the preparations. For Sally, this meant closing her lake house, and for me, it was the final test of preparedness for the harsh winter. I had 5 cubic meters of split firewood and a couple more cubic meters of uncut trees in case of need. I always kept a couple cans of gas for the ATV and snowmobile so I could get out of the cottage whenever I wanted. Early had already agreed to keep my pickup in his shed behind the store in case I needed to go somewhere else. I wasn't going to be plowing miles of winter road when it started snowing. It was especially beautiful in autumn. The leaves shimmered in all shades of red and gold, reflected in the calm waters of the lake. We enjoyed the last warm days before the harsh winter set in. It was on one of these crisp autumn mornings that we saw Teresa standing on the shore as I launched my canoe. "I couldn't do it," she said. I sat in my pickup and looked at the smooth surface of the water, trying to imagine how stupid it would be to turn the steering wheel and run away again. But this time there will be no escape. I no longer intended to give up and give what belonged to me to some scoundrel. For a moment I even thought about killing him, making him pay for all the ruined world he had created. But then I thought about Kelsey, and then again about Teresa, and all the pent-up emotions began to come out. I felt tears fall onto my wrist, and I let out the feelings I had been suppressing all these months. It was a deep and painful cry from the soul, which was more like bitterness from the realization of the theft of all that was most precious. But even that didn't stop me from hearing Sally get into the cab of my truck. "I think you should go back there and sort things out." "What do you think?" she said unexpectedly seriously. I looked at her golden hair braided into a tight braid, and noticed a slight but hesitant smile on her face. She was right. There was a lot of unfinished work left inside me. I turned off the engine and opened the door, going outside. Leaning towards the open window, I simply nodded to her. She slid into the driver's seat, pecked me on the lips, and started the engine. "I'll go to Early and buy something. I'll be back in a couple of hours," she said. I watched her drive away down the gravel road toward the highway, driving her truck toward civilization and Early's store. Teresa was still sitting in the kitchen, staring into her coffee mug. I went to the stove, added coffee to both mugs, and sat down at the table again. She looked up at me, but I just stared back. "I don't even know where to start," she said. "I ruined everything, not only with you, but also with Kelsey and my career. I quit my job when I decided not to file for divorce and took a job as a salesman at a car dealership on Savannah Highway." Teresa looked up and then looked down again. Everything seemed so glamorous and exciting. I thought I had become the most desirable woman by traveling all over the country, but in the end, I lost my soul. I lost everything: my husband, my job, my self-respect, and now my daughter. I looked at her with narrow eyes. "What do you mean when you say you lost your daughter? You took it from me, put a restraining order on me, and now you say you lost it. Damn it, Teresa, you destroyed everything I had." My hands were shaking, and I could barely lift the mug of coffee to my lips, but I did it anyway and continued. "Where is my daughter? What's wrong with her? I don't know if she's alive or dead, you damn bitch. You robbed me of everything I had left." Teresa sat and sobbed, covering her face with her hands, her body trembling in the chair. Looking at her, I saw two people: a woman whom I had once loved with all my heart and knew down to the smallest habits and gestures, and a stranger who now stood in front of me and was so far from my compassion that I did not know, hug her or strangle her. She was clearly suffering, but she didn't even realize how much she had destroyed everything around her. "Where's Kelsey, Teresa?" She was looking in my eyes for at least some sign that I recognized her as a person. "She's in the car," she finally said. "Daryl, please, she doesn't know how to approach you after what I did. She is afraid that you will reject her. It took me a lot of effort to convince her to come here with me." Teresa sank again, still sobbing. I got up from the table and went out to the car. Kelsey was sleeping in the front seat with the seat reclined, covered with a familiar blanket. My mother made it for her when she was a little girl, and we always kept it in the cottage. Kelsey used it every time she came here. I opened the door and squatted down. When she opened her eyes and saw me, she suddenly sat up and threw herself on my neck, bursting into tears. "Dad, forgive me. Please forgive me." I continued to hug my daughter tightly, telling her how much I loved her and how much I missed her. We stood there for several minutes until I looked into her eyes. "Kelsey, no matter what you do, no matter how you behave, it will not diminish my love for you, never. You are everything to me. Understand? You are my whole life." Kelsey began to cry again, and we hugged even tighter until I invited her to walk with me along the lake. I told her that I didn't want her to tell me anything right now. The main thing is that she knows I love her and want her to be with me. We took her things and carried them to the cottage, up into the attic where she always slept as a child. After a while, she put on a sweater and said that she would go for a walk along the path along Oxbrook Creek. When Kelsey left, I nodded toward the kitchen table and Teresa sat back down. I didn't sit down right away, but instead went to the closet where I kept my .38 revolver and a box of shells, and took what I needed from the shelf below. I put the box on the table and sat down opposite Teresa. She looked at me with concern, but I continued to silently pour myself coffee and look at her. Then I pulled a few things out of the box, an old DVD and copies of the divorce papers. "Teresa, you have to tell me everything. I want to know what you did to hurt my daughter so deeply and keep her away from me all these months. I'm not interested in your cheating with James Riley and all that dirt. I want to hear only one thing: why didn't my daughter communicate with me for almost a whole year? Can you do it?" Teresa nodded, biting her lip nervously, and began to speak. "Daryl, I lied to her. I lied to Kelsey about everything, about why we were getting divorced, about why you left, or rather, why I left. You know what they say, one lie leads to a dozen others. This is true. I told her that you were leaving us, divorcing me, because I could not admit to her that I had cheated on you. She winced, remembering that day. Remember my black eye and split lip. God, this is so terrible. I told her that you hit me, and I let her believe it. I didn't tell her the truth. I let her think it was your fault, that you hit me, and that you were leaving for another woman. That's why she didn't contact you. She was on my side, thinking she was protecting me. Her words burned me from the inside. I felt anger rising like a storm. Teresa let my daughter believe that I hit her when I never laid a hand on her in all the years of our marriage. My fingers curled, playing with the box on the table, and I fought the urge to explode with rage. But I knew that this could not be allowed. Teresa, I asked, trying to remain calm, how could you think that all this would end well? You're not a stupid woman. How could you think you could keep up this lie? Daryl, I didn't think so. Everything happened too quickly. I just didn't want to lose her, and one lie after another pulled me deeper into this swamp. Do you remember the day I came home with a bruise? It was James Riley's wife, Melissa, who beat me. When Kelsey saw me like that, I just couldn't tell her the truth. I took it and went with it to the corporate apartment that Riley gave me. I told her that this is our new home, she continued with a bitter smile. And a restraining order? I asked, holding back my irritation. She became embarrassed again and looked away. I was afraid that if Kelsey spoke to you, she would find out the truth. And with the bruises on my face, it was too easy for a lawyer to get this ban. I had long suspected that this was the case when I got the restraining order, but I was still shocked to realize that she had allowed someone to think I had hit her. Teresa, I continued, when did Kelsey find out the truth? Did you tell her? No, she answered quietly. Melissa Riley did it. She came to us one afternoon while I was in the store. She talked to Kelsey. I told her what really happened, that she beat me because she found me with her husband. When I returned, Kelsey already knew the whole truth. She was furious. Teresa sobbed as she tried to continue. I was forced to tell her everything, Daryl. I told her about how I cheated on you, how I lied to her about everything, about why I filed for divorce. This was the hardest conversation of my life. When did this happen? I asked, barely containing my emotions. At the beginning of May. You already left then. I tried to find out where you were, but no one told me where you went. Then I got a call from Earl's store, and his daughter said that you live here in the cottage. I chuckled to myself, remembering how the girl from the store deliberately misinformed Teresa. She told me that she would trick her if she ever decided to look for me. I had to thank her for this. Teresa, let's face it, I began, trying to stay calm. You cheated on me with James Riley. I was never part of this story. You told me only one phrase. I'm filing for divorce. And then you left with another man. I have become an empty place for you. Then you made up a lie that I beat you and got my own daughter to think I was a monster. I put a DVD on the table. Do you know what this is? She nodded and I continued. This is a copy of Melissa Riley's security footage. She gave it to me. In this video, you have sex with her husband in their house. Filmed on camera. 13 episodes, Teresa. I saw everything. She blushed and froze in complete silence. I sighed, collecting my thoughts. Teresa, you ruined us. And even if the divorce is not finalized, we can no longer be together. Teresa, I continued, I don't know why you didn't file for the divorce that you yourself forced on me without saying a word. Honestly, I don't care. I loved you with all my heart and soul, and there was nothing I wouldn't do for you. For that matter, I still love you. But if there is one truth that cannot be ignored, it is this. You will never be my wife again, divorce or not. You must submit these documents. If not you, then I will do it. I showed her a copy of the divorce papers we signed. And one more thing about the disc, I said. This is video footage from cameras in Melissa Riley's house. She gave me this disc. I don't know what her name is now, perhaps she has already given up the surname Riley. But this disc shows you naked in all your glory having sex with her husband. It's not just suspicion, it's all on camera, in their house, in their bed, on their couch, and even on their dining table. You looked like you didn't really like it, but damn, you let him anyway do. And guess what? There is much less of it than I thought, Teresa, but that was apparently enough for you. I was amazed that I said all these words with such composure. When I imagined talking to Teresa about all this, I thought I would say so much more. But suddenly all the words seemed meaningless to me. I just couldn't feel the hatred I thought I felt anymore. I really still love you, Teresa, I said. But it's over between us. You must submit these papers. Previously, when her eyes filled with tears, it touched me to the core, and I could not resist holding her close to me. But that day, looking at her reddened face, I felt only devastation. "Daryl," she said in a whisper, "hold me one last time, please." I stood up and hugged her. We stood for a long time, hugging tightly. I was telling the truth. I still loved her, but her devastating betrayal left nothing to build on. I kissed the top of her head. "Daryl, I will always regret what I did to you, to us," she said, sobbing quietly. "Forgive me someday. Kelsey wants to stay with you for a while, if that's okay." I nodded in agreement. She kissed me one last time, took her bag, and walked to the car. I stood at the door for a long time, watching her drive away along the gravel road, and I felt completely defeated. Kelsey was still walking along the trail, and Sally had not returned from the store. I put on my jacket, launched my canoe, and paddled along the shore. I stayed on the lake for several hours, thinking about what had happened. When I returned, Sally and Kelsey were already sitting in the kitchen, preparing dinner. They both looked at me when I entered. Kelsey ran up to me and hugged me tightly. "Dad, is everything okay?" she asked anxiously. "Yes, everything is fine, honey," I replied. "You stay with me as long as you want." Mom returned to Charleston. "Everything is fine." I did not tell her the details of the conversation with Teresa. All she needed to know was that I loved her and that she could always count on me. That night, when we all went to bed, Sally and I weren't as passionate as usual. We just lay there, talking quietly, hugging each other. Sally had already told Kelsey that we were lovers, but she wasn't going to ruin her time with her dad. Kelsey's reaction was unexpectedly calm. "If you leave because of me," she told Sally, "I will hitchhike to Bangor and fly home." This answer solved everything. Sally stayed in my bed. Over the next few days, Kelsey helped me close up Sally's house for the winter and complete my own preparations for the long winter. We had enough wood, fuel, and supplies to get us through the cold season. Early, and I even agreed that I would leave my pickup truck in his barn when snowfalls made the road impassable. Kelsey and I went to Calais for Thanksgiving to visit my dad and some relatives. Sally was also invited, but she preferred to go to her sister in Dexter. We had a great time, and I was able to reconnect with relatives I hadn't seen for years. Back at the cottage, Kelsey packed her things, and we headed to Bangor so she could catch the plane home. On my way back, I was caught in a severe winter storm. This snowstorm came earlier than expected. Forecasters had expected it to move further toward the Gulf of Maine, but by the time I arrived at Early's store, there was already a foot of snow on the ground, and forecasts were calling for another 12 to 14 inches. I unloaded the ATV, left the pickup in the shed, and drove it back to the cottage. Thus began my first real winter in Maine. A week later, half of the snow that fell melted, and then real winter came. Temperatures dropped, and the next snowfall had already cemented the winter cover, leaving no chance for melting. On Christmas Eve, Sally joined me just in time for the first Christmas storm in several years. When the sky finally cleared, there was already 3 feet of fresh snow on the ground on top of the 2 that had fallen earlier. Since Kelsey wasn't around, Sally and I's activities became much more intense. We spent 3 days sheltered from the blizzard with plenty of wine, delicious food, and the warm comfort of the wood stove. However, the fun had to stop. Sally rode her snowmobile back to start classes on time in January, and I again plunged into my articles dedicated to winter life in the outback and tried to increase the number of freelance projects. I had several successful contracts with magazines, and suddenly an answer came from one agent with whom I had been negotiating for a long time. He offered me a contract to syndicate articles in 14 newspapers at once. It wasn't a lot of money, but along with the existing orders, I had a stable income and a feeling of success in what I was doing. So the winter passed, with occasional wild weekends with Sally. Kelsey sent me regular emails with updates about her studies and social life. With my encouragement, she was able to improve her relationship with her mother and returned to live with Teresa while she studied at the College of Charleston. But as always happens, nothing remains unchanged. One day I heard the sound of an approaching snowmobile. The sound came from afar, muffled by the snow, but on a clear winter day, the sounds easily carried through the forests. I had long ago learned to distinguish the sound of Early's snowmobile, so I was ready for his appearance. When he arrived and kicked the snow off his boots, I noticed something unusually serious in his face. "Daryl, it's about Sally. She had an accident and was severely injured. She was hit by a lumber truck in the Baileyville area. She is still alive, but in very poor condition. I tried to call you, but you didn't turn on the radio. I thought it would be better for you to go there right away to find out how she is," he said with concern. I thanked him, quickly packed my bag, and rode the snowmobile with Early to his store to transfer to a pickup truck and head to Calais. On the way, he said that they were preparing to transport Sally to Bangor because her injuries were too serious for the local hospital. He left me in the hospital and said that his wife would pick him up. When I saw Sally, my heart sank. She was covered in bruises and abrasions, as if she had been beaten half to death. Doctors said she was about to be flown by helicopter to Bangor for surgery. I only managed to look at her briefly, holding her hand. "I'll be by your side soon, honey," I said. "Everything will be fine." I didn't even know what else to say. She was covered in bruises and could barely speak, but she managed a weak smile when I squeezed her hand. "I love you, little one," I whispered before she was taken away. Surprisingly, these were the first words when we directly confessed our love to each other. Early insisted that I go to Bangor without him, saying that his wife could take him home and that Sally needed me. I thanked him and headed to Bangor. If you've never driven Route 9, known as the Airline Highway in the winter, it's probably hard to understand how challenging the road can be, especially in bad weather. The 3-hour journey quickly turned into 6. Luckily, snowplows were ahead of me, clearing the road. When I got to the hospital, Sally had already been wheeled into the operating room, and all I could do was wait. The time dragged on painfully long, and every 10 minutes I approached the nurses, asking for news. Finally, the nurse came to me and told me that Sally had been moved to the post-op ward and that I would be able to see her as soon as she regained consciousness. As she was leaving, one of the doctors came up to me. He explained that since Sally had listed me as an emergency contact, they had given me all the details. She was seriously injured, but we were able to repair the internal damage, he said. Then he paused before adding, "Besides, the baby is fine." I stood there, stunned. What child? Nobody told me about the baby. It's been 19 years since Teresa told me we were expecting a baby. And now I hear this news again, but completely unexpectedly. I thanked the doctor for the information and went up to the room where Sally was supposed to be. A lot went through my head along the way. Of course, it could be my child. Sally and I had been together for most of the past year, and I knew it was possible. However, I couldn't let go of the thought that we needed to discuss this, and it was better to wait until she had fully recovered. When I entered her room, she was still under the influence of painkillers, lying covered in bandages and abrasions, with a bruised but still strong expression on her face. "You look amazing," I tried to joke to lighten the situation. She smiled slightly through the pain. "There's definitely no chance of a beauty contest for me," she answered weakly and reached for my hand. "Thanks for coming, Daryl. You have no idea how important this is to me." She squeezed my hand, pulled me closer, and kissed me on the lips. Then she whispered quietly, "I love you too." I felt the lump in my throat become smaller and smiled at her. We talked about her injuries as much as her condition allowed. I didn't bring up the pregnancy because I knew it would require a more serious conversation once she was fully awake. Sally said nothing about it, and soon began to fall asleep from fatigue and painkillers. I stayed in the room, sitting on the sofa with the help of friendly nurses who brought me blankets and a pillow. The night passed anxiously. Sally was constantly awakened to take vital signs and take medications, and I also woke up with her. The next morning, I learned that Sally would have to spend at least 3 more days in the hospital. Her sister came down from Dexter to help, and I took the opportunity to go get cleaned up and find a place to stay for the night. 4 days later, she was discharged and went to stay with her sister for a week while I returned to West Grand Lake. During this time, no matter how hard I tried, I could not stop thinking about the child. Sally and I never talked about it, and it made it difficult for me to concentrate on work and other things. A few weeks later, Sally returned to the cottage on a snowmobile with Early, who was pulling her on a sleigh. I heard them long before they appeared on the road in winter. The sounds carry far through the forest, and a snowmobile can be heard for several miles. When they arrived, I went out to meet them. "Are you sure you can handle her?" Early asked, slightly worried. "If you need anything, just let me know on the radio, and I or my wife will come right away." I assured him that everything was fine, and after a hot lunch and a cup of coffee, he headed back. "You know that I'll have to take you to the toilet every time you want," I joked, trying to cheer her up. "When is your next visit to the doctor?" Sally stuck her tongue out at me, but immediately admitted that she needed to go to the toilet. So we started a new routine. I took her to Calais for checkups, or to her apartment on the reservation when she wanted a break from life in the forest. A couple of weeks after returning to the cottage, she finally started talking about the main thing. "Daryl, I need to tell you something," she began. "I'm pregnant, and you will become a father." It was more of a statement than a conversation. I told her I already knew the doctors in Bangor told me this when she was in intensive care. "Are you serious?" she asked in surprise. I nodded. "Did you mean what you told me in Calais?" she continued, a little hesitantly. "Did you mean what you said in Bangor?" I asked in response. She nodded, and I smiled back at her. Sometimes you don't need many words to understand each other. We just sat there for a long time, hugging each other, and she put my hand on her stomach, avoiding the places where there were still scars from the operation. "She's already 3 months old," she said, smiling. I realized that Sally became pregnant during the Christmas holidays when we waited out the snowstorm together in the cottage. Sally took the rest of the school year off and continued to recover under my care until the end of the winter. By spring, her belly was already noticeable, and she had almost completely recovered from her injuries. Sally was a strong woman, and despite my urging to return to the apartment in Calais, she insisted on staying in the cottage with me. She knew how much I was looking forward to this winter in Maine and wanted to spend it with me. This winter really lived up to my expectations. During the season, 134 inches of snow fell, and the lake froze 18 inches in some places. It was possible to drive on such ice even with a snowplow. I took care of a pregnant woman who survived an accident and even took her to the toilet a couple of times. Not everyone can boast of such experience. When the last snow melted and the roads became passable again, Sally was already heavily pregnant. We decided to take a little trip before giving birth and went to Charleston for 2 weeks to relax on the beach. Kelsey found us a beach house on the Isle of Palms. Kelsey found us a cabin on the Isle of Palms, and we headed there in early May. The weather was perfect, and Sally and I enjoyed our 2 weeks on the beach. I put on SPF 50 sunscreen to keep from burning in the hot southern sun, but I still got burned a couple of times. One afternoon, as we were sitting on the beach, Kelsey came up to me with a serious look on her face. "Dad, Mom wants to meet you," she said. She said, "Why?" I asked, although I knew that I probably shouldn't have asked. Kelsey just shook her head, but there was sadness in her voice. I agreed to meet Teresa in the evening. Teresa looked good when I saw her. "You look good," I said, trying to start a conversation. "Thank you, Daryl. It doesn't do much good. I hardly go anywhere," she answered with slight irony, and then continued. I asked your lawyer for permission to convey this to you yourself, and everyone agreed. I completed the paperwork as you wanted. This is a final decree of divorce. I thought it would be better for you to get them from me." She handed me the folder, and I saw tears in her eyes. "Daryl, I know you didn't want to hear it back at the cottage, but I have to say it for my own peace of mind. I am truly sorry for everything I did to you. I don't think I fully realized the extent of my betrayal until I came back and realized how difficult it was to repair my relationship with Kelsey. I hoped that I could somehow fix everything and we could become a family again." Teresa said this with such sincerity that I saw how she was preparing herself for this confession. "I need to tell you everything I did, Daryl," she continued. "I was ashamed of who I had become, of my actions, and why I did it. I simply could not live with this burden any longer until I admitted what a terrible wife I was to you. James was the last, but there were others. It all started a few years before him, when I just started working at the company. There were men in the company and clients. Essentially, I sold my soul for career achievements. This is the terrible truth." As I listened to her, I began to remember that I had really noticed changes in her over the last 3 years of working at the firm. At some point, shortly after her business trips began, she changed. I blamed myself for not paying attention then, but in the end, I realized that it was not my fault. All this time, the fault was hers. "Daryl," she continued, "when I left the cottage that fall, I saw Sally in Earl's store. We talked. She's a good woman, Daryl. She cares about you very much. Kelsey loves her. And if you and her still decide to be together, I sincerely hope that you will be happy. You have always been a good person, and you deserve it." It was hard for me to hate her despite everything she had done. I hugged her like a friend, this time saying goodbye forever. I ran my hand through her hair and kissed her forehead, quietly saying goodbye. We would still always be connected through Kelsey, and our paths would cross in the future. But it was at this moment, more than in the fall, that I realized that this was the final goodbye. And this time I forgave her in my heart. "Teresa, find someone you can love again and grow old with him. Maybe one day Kelsey will give us grandchildren and you can be happy." With these words, I said goodbye to my ex-wife, holding in my hands the final decision on divorce. When Sally's daughter was born, the midwife did not spank her bottom, as is sometimes shown in films. She simply cleared the airways, and the girl screamed so loudly that tears came to our eyes. The healthy baby weighed 7 pounds, 10 ounces, with blue eyes and likely blonde hair like her mother. She was placed on Sally's chest and then wrapped in a soft pink blanket. Her name was Samantha Jade Carson. Next to us was Sally's sister, Kelsey, and the midwife. A doctor was present in case of need, but his assistance was not required. Sally, now Mrs. Carson, held her daughter close and looked up at me, grateful that I was always there. But there was no need to thank me. I loved her, and this was the most natural path for us. Sally and I got married on July 4th, exactly 1 year after we met. I almost convinced her to wear the same green fishing boots that she came to me in the first time, but in the end I did without them. Kelsey flew to the wedding and was a bridesmaid. My father was my best man and Early proudly walked Sally down the aisle. It was a small ceremony, and we honeymooned in Bar Harbor and then returned to our cottage. When the time came to have a baby, I decided to invest some of my savings into buying a house on the banks of the St. Johns River. My income from freelancing and syndication had become fairly stable, and with Sally's salary, we could afford a comfortable life in northern Maine. Time passed, and Kelsey completed her education. She moved to Portland, Maine, and took a job at an architecture firm, where she met her future husband. They didn't have children yet. As for Teresa, she never found a new love. She did not remarry and now lives in a small house in the old village of Mount Pleasant across from Charleston, where she has opened her own real estate office. Some time ago, she was diagnosed with breast cancer, but it seems she was able to defeat it. The disease is in remission. Despite everything that happened, we managed to remain friends. We exchange cards for the holidays, and I sometimes call her to see how she is doing. She always reminds me that I was the only real man in her life, and everyone else was just a bunch of XY chromosomes. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one. Click to the next one. Click to the next one.